Thank you for having me. I can't even tell you how thrilled I am to be here, how much I've learned in 2 days, how inspired, if you've been in any way inspired by my work, I am infinitely more inspired by what I've been learning here. I come weighted with not wholly dissimilar, but slightly different challenges, spurred by what I see as compulsions in the archives themselves, the obsessions that shaped imperial priorities and colonial governance in what was the Dutch East Indies and French Indochine in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with the procedures, the accounting, the assessments, the asides, and anxious deliberations, legal and extra-legal, made quixotically and unevenly, with consensus and fierce dissent, with full confidence or with closeted angst, and with no confidence at all. Over the years, I've turned and returned to key phrases, expressions of distrust, untoward anger, and soft-spoken disdain in a dry colonial document, where a turn to a sentiment unravels what are often taken as seamless stories for what was messy situations and politically charged. I treated those intrusions as a portal, and still do, and a diagnostic of what was only dimly legible otherwise. Charging ourselves with designing projects and methodologies that might engage these colonial archives otherwise, I think to treat them neither as dead matter nor mute, rather as dormant, politically shaped by how they convey their content, what they conceal as they opine to reveal, by their illegibilities, and not least by the truth-claiming features embedded in their form, but also dormant in the sense that there are now, and we are now, I think of archiving today as an embrace of what I call politicality, a term I share with the philosopher Etienne Balibar. Politicality comes with engagement, maybe awaiting an emergent form of address, and that's what I think I've seen over the last 2 days. Archiving practices may serve as prescripts for the present or proscriptions for the future. They might incite anticipatory occasions to locate the evidentiary fragments of papers, objects, sensibilities that their new guardians, we, hold tight. The sorts of readings I seek call upon the nuances and crudities of language and gesture, minor changes in vocabularies, unedited and inappropriate written outbursts, micro revisions in the formulaic that could render a common turn of phrase suddenly awkward on the page, a shared common sense perhaps unmoored from where it once rested unchallenged, or a substitution that could signal a revision of governing strategy. I mean, it's possible for it to do all of those things. It's too easy to forget that colonial archives neither reside safely in the definitive past tense, nor adhere only to their own present tense. As the Caribbean poet Derek Walcott put it in his spare poetic rage, the colony is where the rot, I quote, where the rot remains when the men are gone. To embrace his claim that colonialism is an ulcerous crime is to reckon with the politics of his literary finesse. Walcott disallows acts that can be relegated to the passé composé, finished, over, done. I see verbal tense then, something we really don't ever talk about, as an underestimated feature of colonial governance and its political grammar. The conditional tense is the verbal tense of security regimes, of preparedness, and the waivers in decision-making, the ultimate sense of preemptive authority. Quote, if we don't do X, they will, they could, they may do Y. How many times does one find that in the 19th century archives? That conditional tense casts a future trepidation. At best, a vigilant alarm for more surveillance. At worst, it confers license to kill, legitimated as a protective measure of security and self-defense. Imperial mandates don't only manage the parameters of what constitute fact, truth, and reliability. As with Trump, chaos is by design to create semantic and political havoc before policies and practices barely get off the ground and then are reversed. The very substance of the profits and pleasures provided by a colonial capitalism that sought to know what it needed to master, but then, with a capacity to turn away and take care not to admit to know too much, which is what I call at the end of Along the Archival Grain, the politics of disregard. If the Dutch term bewijslast, burden of proof, is not always invoked in the official colonial archives, it was not because it was not present or a priority. Indeed, one could argue that the assessment of what counted as proof, whose words and deeds could be trusted and or have truth-bearing properties, were mainstays of a governmentality that veered between a sense of unassailable white supremacy, barely convincing, undercut by the disquiets and discomforts, fears and anxieties, epistemic, political, and social, that made colonial formation so powerful. Politics, poetics, and grounded philosophy, I guess you can tell so far, have guided my sense of what archival labor demands in the distilled and still violence of colonial situations. George Steiner describes an acquired way of seeing and being with words as a capacity, I quote, to quarry language before it weakens into imagery, into eroded abstraction. I take such a venture to be critical to how we work with colonial archives, perhaps an alternative portal to how subjects are subjugated and subjectivities framed in dispersed and displaced sites of their making. To put it otherwise, sentiment can be a relational measure of comparative worth and value, both instantiating prior relations of unequal worth and productive of them. Sentiments can designate who's high and low, impertinence, shame, disgust, contempt, mark who should act subordinate to whom, and who transgresses that normative assignment. The political force of sentiment, I think, speaks in a metric of worth with shame, envy, rage, bearing a particular kind of burden of proof that may or may not conform to proof conferred in a court of law, or it may. Resentment can be politically charged, upholding a right denied, the quiver of a claim. Like Aristotle's formulation of anger, it could be animated. I was always sort of fascinated by Aristotle's definition of anger. Animated by an offense against the assumed equality of a relationship and the stronger truth of disparity. Maybe what's emergent now is a wholly different archival ecology, excess, ephemera, new lineaments of dissensus, forged in productive impatience. Maybe the impulse to recast relations of value and care are under capital's carceral and commodity occupation, a differential history of metropole and colony, of North and South. Revisioned archiving practices may act as Ian Weissman calls it, a forensic inquiry and restorative justice with abuse, surveillance, and denial put up for scrutiny. Neither masters of war nor empire's architects get the last word. The archiving imperative is clearly outside their control by those marking out alternative histories and futures that refuse to be foreclosed. Thank you.